It was raining the night she gave the ring back. Not a dramatic storm. Just enough rain to blur the streetlights and soak through my jacket while I stood there pretending not to shake. She didn't cry. That was the detail that still hurts the most. Her hands were steady when she placed the ring in my palm, like she was returning something borrowed, something that had never fully belonged to her. The metal was cold, heavier than I remembered. I closed my fingers around it anyway, because letting go felt like admitting the end had already happened. "I'm sorry," she said. 2 words, perfectly practiced, carefully empty. The rain filled the silence for us, tapping against the pavement like it was counting down the seconds of my dignity. I wanted to say something profound, something final. Instead, I nodded like I understood a decision I hadn't agreed to. She walked away without looking back. I stayed long enough for the rain to erase the shape of her from the street. Years passed after that night. Years where I rebuilt myself from the quiet ruins she left behind. I thought the storm had finally moved on. Then one morning, an envelope arrived. Thick paper, elegant lettering. My name written in a hand I would recognize even if I were blind. Inside was her wedding invitation. The storm hadn't returned to hurt me again. It had come to test whether I was still standing in the same place she left me. And this time, I wasn't. When I gave her the ring, the world felt small in the best way. Not empty intimate. Like the universe had leaned in, lowering its voice so it wouldn't interrupt us. We were standing on the rooftop of my building, the concrete still warm from the sun. The city stretched out below, indifferent and endless. But up there it felt like there was space enough for only 2 people and one fragile idea called forever. The sky was bruised with early evening, blue fading into gold, and I remember thinking that if I could freeze a moment, it would be this one. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Or at least, I believed it was. We weren't rich, we weren't certain, but we were sincere. At least, I was. I hadn't planned anything extravagant. No orchestra of roses, no speeches rehearsed in front of a mirror. Just the ring, warm from being clenched too tightly in my pocket, and words that had been living in my chest for months, pressing against my ribs like they wanted out. When I took her hand, she looked surprised, not shocked, not overwhelmed, just alert, as if she sensed this moment coming, but hadn't decided yet what it would mean. Her hands trembled when I slid the ring onto her finger. A small detail, one I would replay later, over and over, trying to decode. She laughed, quick and light, the kind of laugh people use to cover emotions they don't want to name. Sunlight caught the metal and flared briefly, making it look brighter than it really was, more permanent. I remember thinking how unfair it was that something so symbolic could weigh almost nothing, while the promise behind it felt heavy enough to alter my life. She said yes, not loudly, not with tears. Just a soft smile and a nod that felt careful. We talked about the future the way people do when they trying not to scare it away. Apartments we couldn't afford yet. Kitchens with chipped paint. Mornings where we'd argue about coffee and make up before work. Ordinary things dressed up as dreams. We painted them together with words, brushing color onto blank spaces we hadn't lived yet. I listened to her talk about travel, about ambition, about not wanting to disappear into someone else's shadow. I told her I would never let that happen. I promised her space, support, loyalty. I promised without realizing that some promises ask for more than devotion. They ask for alignment. That night, when we went back inside, I noticed how she took the ring off to wash her hands and set it carefully on the sink like it was something delicate. I watched it from the doorway, the way you watch a flame you're afraid might go out. She put it back on afterward, smiling at me like nothing had happened, and I told myself not to read into it. I built my days around her after that. My schedule bent easily, willingly. My priorities rearranged themselves without complaint. I took longer routes home just to walk with her. I turned down opportunities that would have taken me farther away because proximity felt like proof. I learned the rhythm of her moods, the timing of her silences, the subtle shift in her voice when she was drifting inward. She called it love. I called it devotion, and I wore that word like armor. Like sacrifice was the highest form of sincerity. But even then, even in the glow of engagement and shared dreams, there were pauses, small hesitations. A breath held too long before answering questions about us. Moments when her eyes flicked away when I spoke too confidently about the future, like she was checking the exits of a room she hadn't decided to stay in. I noticed them. Of course I did. But love, when it's real on one side, is very good at making excuses for silence. She's just scared, I told myself. Big promises can be overwhelming. Not everyone loves loudly. Sometimes she would trace the ring with her thumb absent-mindedly, as if testing its shape, its weight, its reality. Other times she forgot to wear it at all and laughed it off when I noticed. I didn't want to lose it, she'd say. And I'd nod relieved, choosing trust over discomfort every time. I started writing again around then, not stories letters. Pages filled with things I never said out loud because they sounded too vulnerable when spoken. I wrote about how she made the world feel navigable, how choosing her felt like choosing clarity in a noisy life. I folded those letters and tucked them away, telling myself I'd give them to her someday, when the timing was right, when the future felt more solid. I thought promises were unbreakable things, sacred, binding. I didn't know they only work when both people are afraid to lose them. There was a night, a quiet one, when we sat on opposite ends of the couch, a movie playing neither of us was watching. Her head rested against the armrest instead of my shoulder. I reached for her hand, and she let me, but her fingers didn't curl back. That should have mattered more than it did. Instead, I tightened my grip and leaned closer, as if proximity could manufacture certainty. "Do you ever worry?" I asked her. "About what?" She said, eyes still on the screen. "About us." She smiled then, soft, non-committal. "Sometimes," she said, "but that's normal, right?" I agreed, because agreeing felt safer than asking why. Somewhere between planning forever and living in the present, she began preparing for a different ending, one she never warned me about. I see it now in hindsight, the way you see cracks only after the glass has shattered. The subtle detachment, the way her laughter changed, the way her future tense stopped including me. But at the time, all I saw was the ring, the promise, the belief that loving harder could anchor us both. That night, after she fell asleep, I stood by the window and watched the city breathe below. I held her hand, the ring cool against my skin, and made a quiet vow to protect what we were building. I didn't know protection is useless when the danger is already inside the house. I went to bed believing I was safe, believing I was chosen, believing the promise was mutual. That was the first lie love told me. Love doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures quietly. So softly you mistake the sound for settling, not breaking. At first, it was just time. She started coming home later, always with a reason that sounded reasonable enough to swallow. Group projects, overtime, a friend who needed her. I memorized the explanations, the way you memorize excuses you don't plan to challenge. I told myself trust meant not counting minutes. Even while I watched the clock out of habit, its ticking suddenly louder in the evenings. Waiting became a skill. I learned how to keep dinner warm without overcooking it. How to scroll through my phone without really reading anything. How to pretend I wasn't listening for the sound of her keys at the door. The apartment felt bigger then, rooms stretching with absence, furniture rearranging itself around the question I didn't want to ask. Why does it feel like I am alone, even when I am not? When she finally came home, she brought her smile with her. Not the tired kind, not the relieved kind, the polite kind. She'd kiss my cheek, quick and light, like punctuation at the end of a sentence she'd already finished elsewhere. "Sorry, it ran late," she'd say, shrugging off her jacket, already halfway into another room. I'd nod, always nodding, because nodding kept the peace. Because nodding didn't demand explanations. She seemed unwilling to give. I told myself this was normal. That commitment has seasons. That love isn't always loud. People don't talk enough about how doubt disguises itself as maturity. How easy it is to call discomfort patience when you're afraid of what honesty might cost you. I told myself my unease was just fear, trying to protect me from happiness, the way it always does before something good settles in. Some nights she would curl into my side on the couch, tucking her legs beneath her, fingers tracing invisible patterns on my chest. Little circles, lines that led nowhere. I would freeze in those moments, afraid that if I moved too much, I'd break the spell. Her head fit perfectly under my chin. Her breath slowed, and for a while, the world felt balanced again. Chosen. I lived for those moments. I let them erase the others, because other nights there was distance, cold space, silence heavy enough to bruise. She'd sit at the opposite end of the couch, phone glowing against her face, laughter escaping her in quick bursts that had nothing to do with me. When I asked what was funny, she'd say, "Just something dumb," and tilt the screen away without thinking. I told myself it didn't matter, that privacy wasn't secrecy, that love didn't require full access. In bed, her back turned to me more often than not. The ring would catch the light on the nightstand when she forgot to put it back on, a small circle of gold watching us from the dark. I started noticing how often it wasn't on her finger, how often she touched her hand unconsciously, like she was checking whether it was still there or relieved when it wasn't. I tried harder, loved louder, gave more. I cooked her favorite meals on days she didn't ask for them. I listened more carefully, interrupted less, adjusted myself around the shape of her needs until I barely recognized my own. I canceled plans, rearranged priorities, told myself this was what partnership looked like: flexibility, sacrifice, showing up even when it wasn't convenient. I thought effort could fix imbalance. I thought love was something you could prove if you were willing to suffer quietly enough. There was a night I remember clearly, because it felt like standing on a fault line before the ground split. We were supposed to meet friends for dinner, but she texted last minute saying she was running late. Again, I sat alone at the table, the chair across from me empty, making small talk with people who kept glancing at the door for her like she was a guest of honor. She never showed up. When she finally called, her voice was casual, unbothered. "I lost track of time," she said. No apology, just an explanation. I told her it was fine. Of course I did. But when I got home later, the apartment felt wrong, like something essential had been moved without my permission. I opened the drawer where I kept the letters I'd written her. Pages of devotion, folded carefully, words waiting for a moment that suddenly felt embarrassing to imagine. I took one out, read it, and felt like I was reading a stranger's handwriting. Someone earnest, someone hopeful, someone dangerously certain. I put the letter back. Unsent, unwanted. Love isn't proven by endurance. It's proven by presence. I learned that slowly, through absences, through conversations that ended too quickly, through the way she listened with half her attention, eyes flicking to her phone, body angled away from me, like she was already leaving, through the way she stopped asking about my days, my thoughts, my fears. When I spoke, she nodded at the right moments, but her mind felt elsewhere. Once I asked her directly, "Are we okay?" She paused. Just a second too long. "We're fine," she said. "Why do you always overthink?" The word always landed heavier than it should have. I apologized for asking. That was the night I realized I was starting to disappear inside my own relationship. That loving her had become a performance, me adjusting, me compensating, me filling in gaps she no longer noticed. I felt like I was auditioning for a role I already had, terrified of being replaced without warning. And still, I stayed, because hope is stubborn, because devotion feels noble when you don't yet recognize it as imbalance. She began living like I was optional, not unwanted, just unnecessary. Plans happened without me. Decisions were made before I was consulted. I'd hear about things after the fact, delivered casually, like footnotes in her life. "I didn't think you'd mind," she'd say, and I never did, out loud. But something in me kept a quiet record of every time she chose convenience over connection, of every time I chose silence over truth. The cracks didn't scream when they formed. They whispered. Late one night, while she slept facing away from me, I reached out and touched the ring on her finger, just to reassure myself it was still there. The metal was cool, unresponsive. I lay there listening to her breathe, realizing with a sudden, sick clarity that love can exist without safety, that promises can be worn loosely, slipped off when they start to feel heavy. I stared at the ceiling until morning, understanding something I wasn't ready to accept yet. She was already learning how to live without me, and I was still learning how to hold on. The cracks were no longer invisible. They were just waiting for the right pressure to break me open. The rain didn't ask permission. Neither did the ending. It started as a message, short, polite, too calm for something that would split my life in half. "Can we talk? I need some air." Air. That word should have warned me. I remember looking out the window before I replied, watching the sky darken like it was making a decision of its own. Rain slid down the glass in thin, impatient lines. The kind of rain that doesn't rush, that settles in for the night. I told myself it was just weather, that conversations don't end relationships, people do. I told her I'd meet her downstairs. By the time I stepped outside, the rain had found its rhythm. Not a storm, not a drizzle. Just enough to soak through your clothes and make you aware of every second you stayed exposed. Streetlights reflected off the pavement, turning the ground into a fractured mirror. I saw myself in it, briefly distorted, uncertain, and then she was there. She stood a few steps away from me, not close. Distance always speaks before words do. Her hair was pulled back, jacket zipped to her chin. She looked composed, prepared, like someone who had already rehearsed this moment in her head and was relieved to finally perform it. I realized then how uneven our footing was. I was arriving. She was concluding. "I just needed some air," she said again, gesturing vaguely at the rain, as if the weather were an accomplice. I nodded. Of course I did. Nodding had become my reflex. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the space between us, tapping against metal, concrete, glass. A sound like quiet applause for something I didn't understand yet. I waited for her to say she missed me, to say she was overwhelmed, to say this was just another crack we could step over together. Instead, she reached into her pocket, slowly, carefully, like she was handling something sharp. When she placed the ring in my hand, I felt something in me cave inward. Not heartbreak. Not yet, just a hollowing. A sudden, unmistakable understanding that love can be revoked without mutual consent. That promises don't need both signatures to be undone. The ring was cold. Colder than it had any right to be. Rainwater pooled in my palm, mixing with the weight of it until I couldn't tell where the metal ended and the numbness began. For a second, I just stared at it, stupidly expecting it to explain itself. "I can't do this anymore," she said gently. Gently, as if the softness of her voice could soften the impact. She spoke like she was handling something fragile, like I was the fragile thing. "I've been thinking about it for a while," she continued, eyes drifting somewhere over my shoulder, refusing to meet mine. "It's not fair to either of us to keep pretending." Pretending. The word echoed louder than the rain. Pretending to love me. Pretending to want the future we painted together. Pretending the ring meant what I thought it meant. I wanted to interrupt her. to demand clarity, to ask when a while started before or after she stopped coming home on time, before or after the nights she slept with her back to me. But the words stuck, heavy, useless. I thought about the rooftop, the sunlight on the ring, the way she laughed when she said yes. I wanted to remind her of promises made under better skies, to tell her about the letters in my drawer, about the sacrifices I never called sacrifices because I thought that would cheapen them. I wanted to say that love isn't something you walk away from when it becomes inconvenient. Instead, I stood there, silent, the rain soaked into my jacket, down my collar, through my shoes. I welcomed it, let it blur my vision so she wouldn't see what was happening to my face. Because there are moments when speaking feels like begging, and I wasn't ready to be that small in front of her. "I'm sorry," she said, finally looking at me. Her eyes searched my face, not for pain, but for permission. Permission to leave without feeling cruel. I realized then that she wanted absolution more than closure, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to deny her that. "It's okay," I heard myself say. The lie tasted metallic, like blood. She exhaled, relief flickering across her features for just a second before she masked it again. That moment told me everything I needed to know. This conversation wasn't a loss for her. It was a release. "I hope you understand," she added. I nodded. Again, people don't return rings indoors. They need exits, witnesses, weather dramatic enough to blame. The rain gave her cover, gave her a reason not to linger. She shifted her weight, clearly ready to go, and for a split second, panic surged through me. The kind that makes you reach out instinctively, like a child grabbing for a hand that's already letting go. I didn't reach, because sometimes dignity is the only thing you're allowed to keep. She took a step back, then another. The space between us widened until the rain felt louder than her presence. She turned, hesitated, just long enough to make me wonder if she'd say something else, and then she walked away. No final words, no last touch, no glance over her shoulder. I stood there long after she disappeared down the street, rain pooling at my feet, the ring clenched so tightly in my fist that it left an imprint. Cars passed. People hurried by with umbrellas and destinations. Life, apparently, didn't pause for endings. I opened my hand and looked at the ring again. It looked smaller now, insignificant, a circle without power. I thought about how something that once felt like an anchor now felt like evidence, proof that I had believed harder than I should have. I didn't cry, not then. I tilted my head back and let the rain hit my face, tracing paths down my cheeks that looked enough like tears to fool anyone watching. My chest ached, not with heartbreak, but with restraint. With everything I hadn't said, because I wanted to leave with something intact. Eventually, my phone buzzed. A message from her. "Thank you for understanding." I stared at the screen until it dimmed. I didn't reply. I slipped the ring into my pocket and turned toward the building. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground was reluctant to let me move forward. By the time I reached the door, my clothes were soaked through, clinging to me like proof of what I'd just endured. Inside, the hallway lights flickered, familiar, unchanged. I rode the elevator alone, watching my reflection in the mirrored walls. I looked older, smaller, like someone who had just learned something expensive. When I got to the apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the dark and listened to the rain through the window, louder now, more insistent. I pulled the ring from my pocket and placed it on the table, where it caught a sliver of light and gleamed weakly. I stared at it for a long time. This was the moment everything split before and after. Before belief, after truth. I didn't know what would come next. Only that something had ended without asking if I was ready, and that the rain, indifferent and relentless, would wash the street clean by morning. But it wouldn't wash this out of me. The days after felt unreal, like I had woken up inside someone else's life and was expected to know the routine. Morning came without ceremony. No dramatic grief. No cinematic collapse. Just light slipping through the curtains like it had every other day, indifferent to what had been taken from me. I lay there longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar weight beside me, waiting for the sound of her breathing, the subtle movement that used to anchor me to reality. Nothing. I slept on my side of the bed after that. Not because I needed this space, but because the other side felt haunted. The sheets stayed too neat over there, untouched, like a museum display of something that used to be alive. At night, my body still angled toward her out of habit, muscle memory reaching for a warmth that no longer answered back. Every time I shifted and met only cool fabric, something in my chest tightened quietly, like a knot pulled just a little too far. I learned how quiet a phone can be when no one is thinking about you anymore. At first, I checked it constantly. Every vibration made my pulse spike. Every notification that wasn't her felt like a small disappointment layered on top of a larger one. Eventually, even that anticipation faded. The screen stayed dark for hours, days. Silence stretched until it became the new normal. Meals were the worst. I cooked out of routine, not hunger. I made portions meant for two without thinking. Set plates across from each other. Sat down and stared at the empty chair until the food went cold. Sometimes I ate anyway. Sometimes I couldn't. The refrigerator filled with leftovers I didn't want, reminders of a life that no longer needed planning. Friends reached out. They always do after something ends. Their voices were kind, their concerns sincere, but distant, like people talking to through glass. They said things they thought were helpful. You'll be fine. Time heals everything. You deserve better. They never tell you what time takes first. It takes your appetite, your concentration, your sense of scale. Days blurred together, each one slightly off-center. I went to work. I answered emails. I laughed when required. But everything felt muted, like the volume of my life had been turned down without my permission. Colors looked duller, sounds flatter. Even joy, when it appeared, felt suspicious, like it had shown up at the wrong address. At night, the apartment grew louder, not with noise, but with memory. Every corner held an echo of her presence. Her mug still in the cabinet, her jacket still hanging by the door, because I couldn't bring myself to move it yet. I'd pass it and pause, fingers hovering, unsure whether touching it would help or hurt more. I opened the drawer with the letters one evening, the ones I'd written but never given her. The paper smelled faintly of ink and time. I unfolded one slowly, careful, like it might disintegrate in my hands. The words stared back at me, hopeful, earnest, unbearably sincere. Promises I had made to a future that no longer existed. I felt embarrassed reading them now. Not because the feelings weren't real, but because they had been offered so freely to someone who hadn't regarded them. I refolded the letter and placed it back where it belonged, unsent, unanswered. The ring was harder. I carried it in my pocket for days after the breakup, like a talisman I didn't know how to discard. I'd take it out when I was alone, turning it between my fingers, tracing the small imperfections I remembered noticing the day I bought it. I thought about how confident I'd felt handing over my future wrapped in something so small. Eventually, I knew I couldn't keep it with me anymore. One afternoon, when the light was just right, and the apartment felt temporarily neutral, not hostile, not kind, I opened a drawer I rarely used. I placed the ring inside, nestled it between old receipts and forgotten objects, and closed it gently. Not because I wanted to forget, but because remembering without bleeding felt impossible. The drawer stayed shut after that, but the weight of it lingered. I didn't hate her. That surprised me. Hate would have been easier, cleaner, a straight line from pain to blame. But hatred requires energy, and I was too tired for that. What I felt instead was absence. a hollow where certainty used to live, a dull ache that flared unexpectedly, then receded without warning. What I missed wasn't just her. It was the version of myself that believed. The man who thought love was enough if you gave it honestly. The man who trusted promises because he assumed everyone was as afraid of losing them as he was. That man felt naive now, exposed, like he'd stepped into traffic, assuming the world would stop for him. I avoided places we used to go together, not because I couldn't survive them, but because I didn't want to test how much of myself I'd lose in the process. Still, reminders found me. A song in a grocery store, a laugh that sounded too close to hers, a couple arguing softly on the sidewalk, the way we used to, believing disagreement meant investment. Each time, my chest tightened, then released, tightened, then released. Grief, I learned, isn't a single wound. It's a series of small cuts reopened by memory. One night, I dreamed of the rain. Not the breakup, just the weather. I stood alone under a streetlight, watching water hit the ground and disappear over and over, like proof that some things don't leave marks, no matter how hard they fall. I woke up with my heart racing, sheets twisted around me, the other side of the bed still painfully empty. I sat there until dawn, listening to the city wake up, realizing something I hadn't allowed myself to name yet. The storm hadn't ended when she walked away. It had followed me home, but storms don't last forever. They linger, they test structures. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, between cold dinners and unanswered messages, between unopened drawers and unsent letters, I felt the first faint shift. Not healing, not strength, just awareness that something had been taken from me, and something else was waiting to be reclaimed. I didn't know what that would look like yet. Only that the life I was living no longer fit, and sooner or later I would have to decide whether to keep surviving inside it or step into whatever came next, even if it scared me more than staying broken ever had. The apartment remained silent that night, but for the first time since the rain, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a pause. Healing didn't arrive dramatically. It didn't knock. It didn't announce itself with revelation or relief. It showed up disguised as routine. The first change was the mornings. I started waking before the alarm, before the city remembered how to be loud. The light outside was softer then, forgiving. I'd sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the quiet settle into me, letting my thoughts catch up without drowning me. There was no one beside me to disturb, no one to reach for. And strangely, that absence began to feel less like a wound and more like space. I filled it carefully. I worked harder not out of desperation, but direction. I stayed late when it mattered, left early when it didn't. I stopped apologizing for having boundaries, stopped explaining myself to people who only listened when it was convenient. Each decision felt small on its own, but together they began to form something solid beneath my feet. Pain became discipline. Memory became momentum. I ran in the evenings, letting my breath burn my lungs until thought gave way to rhythm. My body remembered strength before my heart did. I wrote again, not letters this time, but truths. Pages that didn't beg to be understood. Pages that didn't wait for permission. I painted one wall of the apartment a different color, something warmer, something intentional. Proof that I was allowed to alter my surroundings to match who I was becoming. At first, it felt mechanical, forced, like imitation healing, but repetition has a quiet power. And slowly, without asking my opinion, confidence began to return. Not as arrogance, not as bravado, as alignment. Like light creeping back into an abandoned room, hesitant at first, then undeniable once it finds the windows. People noticed, not in the way they do when they sense desperation, but in the way they do when someone stops shrinking. Colleagues leaned in when I spoke. Friends invited me out again, not out of pity, but interest. Opportunities appeared, not because I chased them, but because I finally looked capable of holding them. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in a window downtown and didn't look away. My posture was different, straighter, my eyes steadier. I didn't look happier yet, but I looked present. And presence, I was learning, was its own kind of power. I stopped waiting for apologies that weren't coming. That part was harder than I expected. For a long time, a small, foolish part of me had held space for her regret. Imagined a message that would arrive late at night, heavy with realization. Imagined her understanding what she'd lost only after it was gone. I told myself I didn't need it, but the thought lingered like a bruise you keep touching. Then one day, without ceremony, that hope dissolved. I realized I didn't want her remorse. I wanted my clarity. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, editing my responses, wondering what I should have said. I stopped framing my growth as a reaction to her absence. The rebuild wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't a performance. It was a return. I packed away the past more intentionally then, not erasing it, organizing it. The drawer with the ring stayed closed. The letters remained folded, not because they hurt too much, but because they had taught me enough. They became artifacts of a version of me that loved deeply, but didn't yet know where to place that devotion. Some nights, loneliness still crept in. It always does when life slows down, but it felt different now, less like abandonment, more like a question. What do you want to build next? I answered it slowly. I said no to relationships that felt familiar in the wrong ways. I didn't chase sparks that burned fast and empty. I chose rest, chose intention, chose myself, even when it felt unfamiliar to do so. And somewhere in that choosing, I became someone she wouldn't recognize, not because I changed everything, but because I stopped abandoning myself for comfort. The victory was quiet, almost invisible. There was no moment of triumph, no applause. Just a morning where I realized I hadn't thought about her first thing after waking. An afternoon where her name didn't sting. An evening where the silence felt earned, not imposed. I stood by the window one night, watching rain hit the glass gentler than before, and felt something settle into place. Not forgiveness, not closure, ownership of my time, of my effort, of my worth. I understood then that rebuilding doesn't mean replacing what was lost. It means becoming sturdy enough that loss no longer defines you. And for the first time since the storm, I trusted myself again. That was the first quiet victory. But I didn't yet know how much it would be tested. The envelope arrived on an ordinary morning. That's how fate likes to mock you, by dressing revelation in routine. It slid through the mail slot with a soft, familiar sound, the kind that usually carried nothing more dangerous than bills or advertisements. I almost didn't pick it up right away. Coffee first. Light through the window. Another day claimed and shaped by my own hands. The rebuild had taught me that mornings were mine now, earned through discipline and quiet resolve. But something about the weight of it stopped me. The paper was thick, intentional, cream-colored, textured just enough to suggest permanence. My name sat alone on the front, written carefully, as if the person who penned it wanted to prove they still knew how to be gentle with me. Her name wasn't there, just mine. That detail unsettled me more than if it had been. I turned the envelope over once, twice, like it might reveal another truth if I looked at it long enough. It didn't. It stayed closed, patient, confident. I carried it to the table and set it down beside my mug, the steam curling upward like a question I hadn't answered yet. I opened it slowly. Inside, elegant fonts announced her forever with someone else. The names were centered, balanced, her name first. His beneath it. A date, a location that sounded expensive and certain. The words together with their families hovered near the top, polite and final, like a verdict delivered in cursive. I waited for the pain. It didn't come. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. There was a pause instead, a stillness so complete It felt like the world had taken a breath and was waiting to see what I'd do with it. The invitation lay open in front of me, sunlight catching the embossed letters, turning them into small, deliberate shadows. I read it again, then once more. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be sure of my reaction. Instead of pain, there was clarity. It moved through me quietly, like a tide I didn't fight anymore. I thought of the man whose name I didn't recognize, a stranger who would stand beside her and promise things I once had, a man who would never know the version of her I loved, the one who laughed without measuring herself, who leaned into moments without checking the exits, who once said yes on a rooftop under a forgiving sky. And I realized something that surprised me even more than my koan. I didn't envy him, because the version of her he was marrying wasn't the one I missed. She had changed long before she left. I had felt it, lived it, loved around it. And whatever she had become after the rain was not something I wanted to inherit. I folded the invitation once and set it down. The storm hadn't come to drown me. It had come to show me how far I'd walked since the rain. Memory tried to intrude then, as it always does when you least expect it, the night she returned the ring. The way the metal had felt in my palm. The sound of rain striking pavement like punctuation at the end of a sentence. I remembered thinking that was the worst moment of my life. Standing there now, invitation in hand, I understood how wrong I'd been. That night had broken me open. This morning showed me what had grown back. I carried the invitation to the window. Outside, the city moved on in its usual rhythm. Cars passed. People hurried with umbrellas folded under their arms, prepared but unnecessary. The sky was clear, bright, indifferent in the best way. I thought about calling someone, sharing the news, letting it land somewhere other than inside my chest. But the urge faded as quickly as it appeared. This moment felt private, not secretive, just complete. I sat down and poured another cup of coffee. As the mug warmed my hands, I studied the invitation again, this time with a strange sense of gratitude. Not for the ending it represented, but for the honesty it forced. There would be no surprise encounter months from now. No accidental discovery on social media. No unresolved wondering. This was it, the final punctuation. I walked to the drawer, the one I rarely opened. It slid out with a soft resistance, like it recognized what was coming. Inside lay the ring, exactly where I'd left it. Still, small, unchanged. I took it out and placed it beside the invitation, two artifacts from different chapters of the same story. For a moment, they looked like they belonged together. I thought about the man I had been when I bought that ring. How certain he was. How willing. How unafraid of giving everything he had to someone he believed would guard it. I didn't mock him for it. I didn't pity him either. I honored him because he loved honestly. And that still mattered. I placed the ring back in the drawer. Closed it. This time, there was no hesitation. No ache. Just closure shaped like a quiet decision. The invitation remained on the table. I didn't tear it up. I didn't peep it either. I slipped it back into its envelope and set it on the counter, unsure yet of where it belonged. Some things don't need immediate answers. They need perspective. Later that day, I went for a walk. The air was crisp, carrying the faint promise of change. Leaves shifted under my feet. The city felt newly navigable, like I had finally learned its language. Couples passed me, some laughing, some arguing softly, some walking in practiced silence. I watched them with curiosity instead of longing. I wondered briefly if she was happy. The question didn't hurt. That surprised me too. I realized I didn't need the answer. Happiness, I had learned, isn't something you verify from the outside. And whatever she had chosen, whatever life she was building, no longer intersected with mine in a way that demanded my emotional participation. I returned home as the light softened, shadows stretching across the floor like long memories. The apartment felt settled. earned. I moved through it easily, without the sense that something was missing. That night, I took the envelope and placed it in a box with other things from my past. Not hidden, not displayed, just stored. A chapter acknowledged, not revisited. As I closed the box, a thought surfaced, not sharp, not painful, just clear. I had survived the ending I once thought would end me. The storm had done its work. It had stripped away illusions, soaked through denial, forced me to stand alone long enough to understand who I was without being reflected in someone else's eyes. I turned off the lights and stood by the window one last time, watching the city settle into night. Somewhere out there, she was planning a wedding, choosing flowers, writing vows, moving forward. So was I, just in a different direction. And for the first time, that difference felt like freedom. I held the invitation longer than I expected to. It rested between my fingers like a fragile truce between past and present, its edges already softened from being unfolded and refolded too many times. I carried it from room to room without realizing it, kitchen to window, window to couch, as if movement alone might help me decide what still needed to be done. Attend, decline, disappear. Each option felt heavy in a different way. Attending would mean witnessing a life she chose after me, standing among strangers who only knew the polished version of her, smiling politely while history sat quietly in my chest, well-behaved but alive. It would mean proving something to her, to myself, to ghosts that didn't need convincing anymore. Declining would mean explanation, words carefully selected to sound gracious, healed, unaffected. A response letter pretending that indifference can be folded neatly into an envelope. And disappearing, doing nothing at all, felt, strangely, like the most honest answer. I thought about the boy I used to be. The one standing in the rain, shoulders squared, refusing to beg because dignity was the last thing he could still protect. The ring burning into his palm like a brand. His heart still open, even as something permanent was being taken from him. He believed endings required acknowledgement. He believed love demanded final words. I sat at the table and placed the invitation down in front of me, smoothing it flat. The paper caught the afternoon light, the same way it had that first morning. Elegant, unapologetic, certain of its place in the world. I wasn't angry at it. That mattered. Anger would have meant there was still something unresolved. But what I felt instead was distance, clean, deliberate, earned. The kind of distance you walk into, not the kind that's forced on you. Outside, clouds gathered slowly, not threatening, just present, the sky shifting shades, like it was thinking too. I remembered how we used to make decisions together, how she would pace while I sat still, how I would speak carefully while she interrupted herself, changing her mind mid-sentence. We had believed compromise was the same thing as balance. It wasn't. Balance is knowing when to stop carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. I imagined myself at the ceremony, the music swelling, her dress moving toward the altar, the moment when all eyes would turn, expecting awe, approval, applause. I knew myself well enough to know I wouldn't ruin it. I would be composed, respectful, invisible, but I would not be free. I imagined sending a response instead, writing something kind, something brief, something that would allow her to tell herself I was fine, that we had ended gently, that no damage lingered. But the truth was simpler. I didn't owe the past reassurance. I picked up the invitation again and felt its weight one last time, not as a test, but as confirmation. My reflection appeared faintly on the glossy surface, distorted and distant. A reminder that I wasn't the man in that story anymore. Evening arrived quietly. I turned on a lamp. Its warm light softened the room, casting familiar shadows across walls I had rebuilt piece by piece. The apartment no longer echoed. It held me now, witnessed my mornings, accepted my silences. I walked to the drawer. The same one, the one that had learned my hands by now. When I opened it, the ring lay exactly where I had left it. Patient, neutral, no longer accusing. I placed the invitation beside it, aligning the edges carefully, as if presentation still mattered. For a moment, I hesitated, not because it hurt, but because this was the final act of a long internal conversation. I wasn't hiding them away as wounds. I was storing them as proof. Proof that I had loved without conditions. Proof that I had survived being left. Proof that I had chosen myself when choosing her was no longer an option. I closed the drawer. The sound was soft, final, not dramatic enough to be cinematic. Just real. Later, as night settled in, rain began to fall. Not heavy, not urgent. A gentle rhythm against the windows. I stood and listened, hands in my pockets, breathing in the quiet. Once, rain had marked the end of everything I thought I was. Now, it just sounded like weather. My phone buzzed on the table. A notification. Nothing important. The world continuing, indifferent and generous all at once. I didn't check it right away. I thought about closure. How people chase it like a ceremony. Like something that has to be witnessed, validated, spoken aloud. But some chapters don't need closure. They need distance. Distance to become memory instead of identity. Distance to let meaning settle without reopening the wound. I never sent a response. Not out of bitterness. Not out of fear. But because silence, this time, was complete. As I turned off the lights and walked toward bed, the rain softened, tapering into a whisper. Tomorrow would come. And the next day. And the one after that, each carrying less of her, more of me. In the darkness, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Peace, not the loud kind. The quiet kind that stays. And somewhere between the sound of rain and the steady rhythm of my own breath, I understood. Some decisions don't announce themselves. They simply allow you to keep walking forward without looking back. I don't wish her pain. That realization arrived quietly, without ceremony, the way most truths do when they're finally ready to be accepted. I was standing at my window one evening, watching the city dim itself into softer shapes, when it settled in my chest like something finished. Pain keeps you tethered to the past. It loops memory into punishment. It convinces you that suffering is the last proof love ever existed. I didn't want that anymore. What I feel now is perspective. Distance earned, not forced. Strength that doesn't announce itself, but shows up every morning when I wake up unafraid of my own thoughts. She returned my ring in the rain. Years later, she sent me proof unintentionally, unknowingly, that letting her go saved me. That irony doesn't sting. It steadies me. I remember the night clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was definitive. Rain has a way of sealing moments into memory, as if water itself understands permanence better than people do. She had stood across from me, hair darkened, eyes careful, voice rehearsed. The ring had been cold in my palm, heavier than metal should ever be. Back then, I thought that moment would define me forever. I was wrong. It didn't define me. It revealed me. In the months that followed, I lived inside absence, learned the architecture of loneliness, learned how silence echoes differently when you stop fighting it. I learned that grief isn't loud, it's repetitive. It asks the same questions every day until you finally stop answering. And slowly, without realizing when it began, I stopped reaching backward. I started building forward. I filled my walls with things that reflected me instead of us. A painting I bought on a whim, abstract, imperfect, unapologetic, hung where our photos used to be. I didn't need faces smiling back at me anymore. I needed reminders that art doesn't ask permission to exist. I wrote again. Not about her. Not about loss. About mornings. About growth. About the quiet violence of becoming someone new. My words changed. Less pleading, more grounded. They stopped asking why and started stating what is. People noticed the difference before I did. They said I looked taller, calmer, like someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Opportunities followed, not because I chased them, but because I was finally visible to myself. Confidence didn't arrive like a miracle. It crept in, subtle and persistent, filling corners of me that had been hollow for too long. And then, one morning, the invitation arrived. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. I read her name and felt neutral, not numb-present, fully here, as if the past had finally lost its authority over my body. I understood then that healing isn't the absence of memory. It's memory without power. The man she was marrying would never know the version of her I loved. The late-night conversations, the unfinished dreams. The woman who once whispered forever like it was sacred. But more importantly, I no longer wanted the version she became. That clarity was the final gift. I didn't attend the wedding. I didn't send regrets. I didn't ask mutual friends how she looked, or if she smiled, or if she hesitated. I placed the invitation in the same drawer as the ring, not as a shrine, not as a wound, but as evidence of who I was, of what I survived, of what I refused to repeat. Sometimes, late at night, I open that drawer. Not often, only when I need reminding. The ring doesn't hurt anymore. It looks smaller than I remember, almost fragile. Proof that devotion, when unreturned, eventually collapses under its own weight. I close the drawer and return to my life. A life that doesn't require permission. A life that doesn't negotiate its worth. I've learned something important since then. Love should never require you to disappear. Promises should never feel heavier on one heart than the other. And the right person will never make you feel optional in your own story. This isn't a story about loss. It's a story about becoming. About the quiet, stubborn courage it takes to stop chasing people who have already decided to leave. About learning that closure isn't something you receive, it's something you choose. I don't hate her. I don't bless her either. I release her. The rain still comes sometimes, soft against glass, familiar in its rhythm. But it no longer sounds like endings. It sounds like background noise to a life in motion. The man I am now would never beg in the rain. He wouldn't stand there holding promises alone. He wouldn't confuse endurance for love. He wouldn't shrink himself to fit inside someone else's uncertainty. That man understands something the boy never could. Walking away isn't weakness. It's wisdom arriving late, but arriving fully formed. And as I turn off the lights, the city glowing faintly beyond the window, I feel it again, that steady, unremarkable peace. Not the kind that demands witnesses. The kind that lasts. This is my legacy. Not the love that broke me, but the self I rebuilt afterward. And for the first time, the future doesn't feel like something I'm bracing for. It feels like something I'm finally ready to live.